The title of my presentation is What Happens When We Stop Dreaming? And it's my humble attempt to account for the waning of post-independence radicalism in the Anglophone Caribbean. It's a highly theoretical piece, and it deviates from the, what has been the practice over the couple of days of utilizing case studies, which I think were all of which were very informative. But I attempt here to see what kind of lessons, theoretical lessons, we can abstract from many of those case studies. But I'm using my own personal experience, both as an on-the-ground activist and as a student of intellectual inquiry. Just as the Caribbean, just as the rest of the world in the period of the decade of the 1960s, the Anglophonic Caribbean was not in any way isolated or insulated from that revolutionary fervor that characterized the period. We had both our specific 1968 in the form of the Rodney riots, well, not the Rodney King, but the Walter Rodney, and we had the more extended 1968, the movements that preceded and succeeded and followed that period. In terms of the Rodney riots, you all would know Walter Rodney, a very world-renowned Marxist, Pan-Africanist scholar of the highest regard. And he was a lecturer at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And he had left to attend the Black Writers' Conference in Montreal, Canada. And upon his return, he was refused entry by the then government. And the students, of course, organized the protest, which flew over beyond the borders of the campus, and violence, police repression, and so forth. So we had that specific experience, 1968 experience, in Jamaica. But but before that, we had the independence movement, the movements for independence from colonialism, and radical in its own right. We had also the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad, which was a revolution against the Black uprising, the uprising of the Black masses against the Eric Williams government. And we had, apart from these political uprisings and so forth, we had revolution in culture. You all know reggae music, the Bob Marley universalization of the Rastafarian culture, and we had calypso, reggae, and so forth, all of which served as commentary, social critique, and so forth. So they were not just means of entertainment, but means of education and mobilization. And, but those are just some of the events that occurred in 1968 itself, and a little before and a little after. One of the important lessons that I need to pinpoint here is that many of these uprisings and protests and so forth were against persons who themselves were former radicals. For example, the Black Power Revolution in uprising in Trinidad. It was against Eric Williams. You all know Eric Williams wrote Capitalism and Slavery, which inspired a lot of radical debate on the relationship between slavery and capitalism and so forth. So he was a radical thinker, but as he assumed power, he became very repressive. And it is even thought that he banned his own book because the book was against the neoliberal kind of economic system that he, right? So, and Hugh Shearer too, he was prime minister when Walter Rodney was refused entrance in the Jamaica. And if you know Hugh Shearer, he was, in his days, he was very noted and respected trade unionist. So I think one of the important lessons that we can learn here is that those leaders were satisfied with their little specific narrow achievements. In the case of Eric Williams, the achievement of the replacement of European rule with black rule in the Caribbean. And those little achievements, with those little achievements, they stopped dreaming. They stopped dreaming of a better world. They stopped dreaming of expanding the borders and perimeters of freedom and consciousness and so forth. And that is exactly what the presentation is about. As I said, a lot of this is based on my own personal experience. These are some images of where I myself have taken part in like what I call the politics of protest, with specific, narrow, restricted aims and so forth. So, on my own experience is that what I'm seeing is that on the one hand, there are a lot of movements on the ground with very like specific, narrow aims, and then, but those movements are not guided in any way by any kind of broader notions of freedom, broader notions of liberty. They are guided mainly by narrow political gains and achievements and so forth, which I call politics of protest. On the other hand, you have very important intellectual inquiry going on in the halls of the universities and so across the world, and there seems to be now a separation of the two. And I think that's partly responsible for the waning of this radicalism so that is my main thesis. What happens when we stop dreaming? The title is based on a debate between Walter Rodney and Wilson Aras. You know, Walter Rodney represents the underground kind of revolutionary or activist, and Wilson Aras represents the kind of critical post-colonial kind of thinker. And they had a debate. We lost evidence of the debate, but the main thing that stood out in this debate is a question posed by Rodney to Aras. So what happens when we stop dreaming? Are we not faced again with the obstinate realities on the ground, like political repression, economic oppression, and so forth? And of course, they both went into the debate with different notions of what dreaming is, right? For Walter Rodney, dream represents just a form of escapism from their natural responsibility or involvement, for involvement in radical activities and so forth. But for Aras, dreaming represents something else. It represents the use of the radical and the creative imagination. So both went into the debate with different notions of dreaming. And my presentation is how we can synthesize these two notions of social change, of social movements, and so forth. Rodney was interesting in many ways because he represents the fusion of Marxism, Pan-Africanism, and the nationalist, cultural nationalism, and so forth. For many, those are opposing views on or theories of social movement and activism and change and so forth. But if you are familiar with the Caribbean realities, is that the race, class, and so forth all intersect in the realities of the Caribbean. And of course, as Marxism emphasizes, is the centrality of class and class conflict. Social change as a primarily a matter of the change in the productive relations, which is necessarily followed by changes in superstructures and things like that. Pan-Africanism, on the other hand, represents the centrality of race as opposed to class. And you're all familiar with Du Bois' famous statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And in terms of the nationalism, emphasized like domestic ownership of the formal mechanisms of power and the means of economic and cultural production. So all of these strands fused and were synthesized by Walter Rodney. And they were, as I said, theoretically, they were conflicting, but in the substantive, if you are familiar with the substantive realities of the Caribbean and so forth, you would see that there's nothing conflicting about being at the same time a Marxist and a Pan-Africanist, thing like that. All right? So there are debates around how Rodney were able to negotiate these various tendencies in his academic writings and in his underground activism and so forth. And they're very different readings. But for me, this Rodney used these as strategies in his activism and in his movement against oppression and so forth. But what Rodney represents as a kind of guerrilla intellectualism that I see very lacking. As I said before, on the one hand, we have persons engaged in political activities on the ground, of course, but those are oftentimes not informed by any broader vision of what freedom is, any broader vision of what liberty is, or those are mainly concentrated towards accomplishing narrow and restricted kind of achievements and so forth. And oftentimes, after those are gained, the revolutionary impulse or fervor dies, and the imagination becomes frozen. So, and this is where Aras comes in, because for Aras, the imagination is central in any activism. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Castoriadis, but he was a former Marxist. In his time, he was a Marxist. In his early life, he was Marxist. And for him, the Marx historic dialectics and so forth become very restrictive of what he called the use of the radical imagination and so forth. So he called for a fusion of the freeing up of the imagination in social activism. Just like, and for Aras, just like Castoriadis, he saw social change comes from the deployment of this radical imagination. Without such deployment, what is referred to as revolutionary activity leads merely to the reproduction of imposed but invisible epistemes. And so genuine social change should confront the dominant colonial categories within which everyday Caribbean reality is encoded. And for Sylvia Wynter, an ex-Caribbean writer, refers to this as the coloniality of being. And for her, she posits that without confronting this coloniality of being, there would be no success in confronting the coloniality of power. So we must address this coloniality of being while simultaneously as we address the coloniality of power. Social change entails disentanglement from the old European heritage and the fashioning of a new civilization. We should take for Wilson Aras, we should take one step backward at times from the ontic level of everyday politics and move towards the ontological level of guiding philosophies and prepossessions within our civilization, and we must problematize these. In this approach, Aras is in company, of course, with broader post-colonial studies tradition. Aras critiques the very institutional codes within which reality is presented to us. This implies that reality itself is socially constructed, and as such, functions as the privileged rehearsing of the colonial dream. Real social change lies in uprooting these institutional codes that keep presenting this reality as natural and inevitable, if not charismatic, appealing, and fascinating. So he cautions that great care need to be invested in avoiding categories that act as repetitive vestiges of old and, by definition, non-Caribbean order. And so principally what I'm saying here is that Aras and Rodney represents two opposing tendencies in radical movement. One in which radical movement is one in which there is a move to reactivate the positivist conception of the social world and a scientific vision of history. And on the other hand, one in which there as a problematizing of those very deterministic scientific notion of what social change should be. So what I'm seeing is that on the one hand, there's this tendency that in the sacred halls of the universities, there are a lot of writings, a lot of revolutionary writings, a lot of inquiry, and in many ways, these are disengaged from any movement on the ground. So they're what, if anything, the scholars and the activists of the 60s, they represent a fusing of these two radical tendencies. Right? So on the one hand, now what I'm seeing is that you have a lot of movement on the ground, even in the Caribbean, but these are movements with very restricted demands, very narrow and restrictive demands, and I think they underlined a lack of imagination. They underscored the lack of the use of the radical and creative imagination. And on the other hand, there are portions like protected by the immunity that comes with being part of a university community of inquiry, and doing a lot of very important intellectual work, but the two are not coming together. So in my own research, I think what I find is that this disengagement is largely responsible for the waning of the radicalism that had characterized that period. Thank you very much. Thank you.